All right, folks, it is 9:01 and it is time for our monthly urban updates from the Urban Soil Health team. I'm so excited to see you all here today. So we're going to get right into it. We've got our agenda for today, our technical topic. We've got a really great guest speaker coming in and speaking to us about perennial fruit crops. After we're done with that conversation, we're going to go into statewide and regional updates. So if you guys have any updates from your area, start thinking about them now. Start getting those links and put them in the chat or getting ready to go off mute and tell us all about it. And then at the end, we'll have other question and answer session and then just talking about some other resources. So we've got a full schedule and lots of great information for you today. But without further ado, we're going to start off with a really great colleague and friend coming all the way from the University of Minnesota Extension. So we've got Madeline Wimmer. She is an extension educator in the food systems and is a specialist with fruit crops, has been working for years and years and years on fruit crops with a special partner heart for wine grapes and other grapes, table grapes. But today she's going to be talking to us generally about fruit crops. So Madeline, I would love for you to take over and show us the path through perennial fruit crops, please.
Thanks, Terry. I appreciate your introduction. I'm going to get my screen shared here. Again, thanks for the introduction. Today I'll be talking a little bit about land considerations, site preparation, and then management of perennial fruit crops, and sort of in the context of diversified farming systems. But what I talk about today is applicable in a lot of settings. And as a heads up, again, talking about perennial fruits, so we're not really talking as much about melons or some fruit crops that are annuals. This does cover strawberries as well, but we'll kind of get started here. Okay, so just an outline for today's talk. I'm going to give you all sort of an intro to perennial fruit crops for those who are a little less familiar. We'll be looping in a lot of topics related to sustainability in this talk. And then we'll kind of talk more about diversifying with fruit crops, the benefits, some gateway fruits that would be best to start with, very goal-oriented. And then we'll talk about fruit production, mainly site preparations and considerations for cultivar or variety selection, as well as an overview of fruit production needs. And just again, kind of like very basic, there's this question of what is a fruit anyway? And then of course we've got the crying tomato there, because there's always that conversation of, are some things fruits or vegetables? And what this really comes down to are culinary definitions of what a fruit is versus the botanical definition. So the botanical definition is that a fruit is either fleshy or it's a dry, ripened, technically an ovary of a flowering plant that is enclosing seeds. And this encapsulates a lot of different plant parts or a lot of different plants that technically have fruits, like the maple seed there that you can see. And then within that botanical definition, there's a lot of things that we actually end up eating and calling fruits that are technically not made out of that ovarian tissue. So those are called accessory fruits, and it doesn't need to get too complicated beyond that. But of course, the culinary viewpoint is more looking about how you use a fruit. Oftentimes, things like peppers or tomatoes are treated more like vegetables. So what do? I work with woody as well as herbaceous perennials. So an herbaceous perennial would be like a strawberry that grows and it's green all, throughout the growing season, and then it dies back at the end of the year. Typically, in more northern climates, those strawberries are going to be covered, but they will still come back year after year until that whole fruit stand needs to be renewed. But yeah, sometimes I end up working with pumpkins, or sometimes I end up working with hops because, a lot of apple growers also grow pumpkins for agritourism, And hops growers are working with a plant that is also a very, very vigorous herbaceous perennial. But mostly, the big two crops within my region are apples and cold climate grapes, typically wine grapes, but we do actually have some table grapes that will be released soon. Brambles, such as raspberries, blackcap raspberries. We don't work with blackberries as much, but that would be more in your region where blackberries work out. And then there's a lot of different shrub crops like currants, blueberries, honeyberries, and I already had mentioned the strawberries. So a lot of these crops have similar needs for maintenance. There are differences, and that can be challenging sometimes to really hit the whole scope in a general talk like this, but we'll do our best. So again, on the side here, just to give you a visual representation, of course, I've got things that are labeled that are not fruits, but all of those are examples of herbaceous perennials. They're not necessarily going to become woody and then bear fruit the following year from woody structures, but it's typically the crown of the plant where the buds are located that still need to intercept sunlight throughout the growing season. Strawberries, especially June-bearing strawberries, which produce fruit once per year and then kind of stop producing fruit. They need that sunlight. They need care even when they're not producing fruit so that you can enhance the fruit production for the following year. And then you have crops like raspberries, which typically kind of go through these 1-year cycles. Some of them can produce shoots and bear fruit that same year. Some of them need to produce a shoot and then that shoot will produce fruit the following year, and you kind of cycle through those. And then you have woodier shrubs like currants and blueberries that have their own pruning necessities, vines like grapes, vines like hardy kiwis, and then tree crops. Whereas there's some distinguishments between things like apples as well as stone fruits. So coming into the topic of perennial, woody perennial biology, it's just helpful to keep in mind, especially for those folks who are really, working with annuals. You usually recognize that seeds carry carbohydrate reserves as well as those initial cotyledons that help get the plant started. Similarly, the woody perennials are going to be pulling in, carbohydrates from photosynthesizing all season long. Those carbohydrates are going to be living in the wood of a plant as well as the root system. And then those reserves are then flooded back up into dormant buds that next growing season in order to break the buds and help those leaves grow initially before they really start photosynthesizing and bringing materials back in. With a lot of perennials, even most strawberries, I would say you tend to have like, it's helpful to have the mindset that you have like 3 different plant management zones. So you're managing your actual crop, and that's sort of its own zone. And then you have the zone that's adjacent to your crop, which you're typically trying to take care of in a way where you're preventing annual weeds from producing, etc. Maybe you have a cover crop if it's a more established fruit crop. And then you have between your rows, which is typically, we'll talk more about it, but that's going to be an alleyway that is covered with some sort of vegetation. So how can you really start to think about sustainability and fruit production? Sustainability has a lot of different aspects to it in order to be kind of this holistic viewpoint, including plant longevity and health, site longevity, environmental conservation within decision making, which is kind of, that very go-to thought process of being sustainable, right? You're environmentally sustainable. Climate resilience can be wrapped up into this, as well as thinking about worker and family health and well-being, your longevity, your ability to actually, continue working with your crops. And then community vitality. How does a growing operation impact the community around it? And within at least the first couple of these, the plant longevity and health and site longevity, you can think, this whole web is influenced by a lot of aspects, but and most importantly, thinking about cultivar selection, and how you prepare a site, how densely you're planting your plants, what is the layout like, that can all affect longevity as well as management techniques. What is your approach to managing insects, pests, weeds, all of that. So I really like this concept here. David Granitstein is an emeritus professor in Washington, and he's actually done a lot of writing and work considering agroecology within fruit crops and alternatives to conventional herbicides and fruit crops. And he talks about sustainability approaches that there's kind of these three approaches to sustainability. And so there's resource efficiency. So trying to be more precise or more accurate with the inputs that we're choosing to use within a fruit crop stand. Substitution. So that would be like replacing insecticides with mating disruption or finding alternative or complementary ways to approach weed management. And then there's the whole concept of redesign, which I think can be kind of the most challenging for a lot of folks to think about. And this is where, yeah, basically kind of trying to have an agroecological approach to growing fruit crops, which can be challenging because when we're growing fruit crops, we're not necessarily growing very traditional nature guided trees or vines. Therefore, we're really trying to maximize fruit production. And sometimes the concepts of ecology don't always fit that goal. So, what are the benefits of diversifying with fruit, especially for folks who already have specialty crop farms? It can be, this transition from just working with annuals to perennials allows us to adapt a legacy mindset. All of a sudden, you're thinking years into the future about how your land is going to continue to support your crops. Your plants, depending on what you're working with, might be in for 10 to 20 or more years. And then there's kind of this on-farm draw for agritourism or U-pick operations. That always complicates things as well. As you can imagine, the more that you're bringing people onto your property, you're kind of changing hats with what you're doing. You're not just a grower at that point. Um, but even beyond that, if you're not bringing people to you, if you already have a CSA box, it kind of allows you to have these unique offerings and expansion in what you can offer for value added products. Making vinegar, making jams, making wine, all of that, cider, and all of those types of products. And then, of course, there's sort of this impact of because you're putting in perennial plants, you're not necessarily renewing and tilling constantly like you might be with some types of annual operations, depending on how they're being managed. So you're not disrupting the soil as much, which there are tillers that are available for working with fruit crops, but typically those aren't implemented quite as much. Supporting pollinators, a lot of fruit crops are insect pollinated. So when you have these resources on your property, then you're going to be able to support more local pollinators and hopefully have a management plan that also continues to protect pollinators based on which insecticides are being used. And then there's this question of climate resilience, like can you plant perennial fruit crops as a plan for climate resilience? And I would say yes, but of course this is sort of, compared to what? So I have this graphic here showing annual grains versus perennial grains. So you have wheat on the left and then kerns on the right. And of course, it's showing that kernza as a perennial grain is going to be creating a lot more root systems, which can help pull carbon out of the air, similar to like a lot of prairie systems, how those root masses can be really beneficial. So, when you're comparing annual wheat to Kernza, it's like, yeah, of course, it's obvious there. But with fruit crops, especially with the direction that a lot of people have gone with growing, for example, high density apples. You're really focusing on growing fruit, not necessarily the wood. Um, and that's been going on for a long time, that folks have been changing their pruning practices to shape trees or shape vines in a way that you maximize light interception, which means that you can't have super large canopies in ratio to the amount of fruit that the plant is producing. So if carbon capturing is the goal, maybe fruit crops can help support this a little bit, but they're not necessarily going to be this big solution. Um, and just throwing this up here again, so thinking about, you can see here some high density apple trees next to these older apple trees, and how much more wood there is on the older apple trees. And so it's the actual, even if you, grow up poplar stands and you harvest that wood and you use that wood for building, the idea is that you're not burning that wood. It's not going anywhere. So it's actually captured carbon and is staying in that situation. And there's kind of, this thought process similar with a lot of farming, right? Folks who might not have a lot of experience can see farming as romantic in general, and same with fruits. Fruits are very romantic, right? They house the children of a lot of different trees and all that. They're sweet, sometimes they're sour, they're exciting, they have aromas, they have flavors. But growing fruit itself is not always a romantic process, because as we've bred for fruits with higher sugar contents, um, and larger fruits, everybody wants your fruit. Fungal pathogens, sometimes bacteria, and whether they want the fruit itself or they want to be attacking the root system or other parts of the plant's leaves. And then, of course, birds, wildlife, again, whether they're actually eating the fruit or just disturbing your woody plant from being able to establish, it's problematic. And so, also, within managing fruit crops, there's a lot that we can do with canopy management, and we'll talk more about that. But being able to develop a spray program can be really key for quality production. There are some folks who will say, well, I want to grow organically, I don't want to spray. But oftentimes, if you go to large commercial fruit operations, it's not that they're not spraying, they're just using organic approved materials in their operation for spraying. And especially with key pests like fungal pathogens, oftentimes the solution for managing fungal pathogens is prevention. So a lot of the sprays that are put down are quite preventative. And then, there's other things like, do you have the capacity to store your fruit? Do you need to? Are you able to get through it fast enough? Um, a lot of considerations when it comes to growing fruit crops. So let's talk a little bit more about fruit crop and cultivar selection. For those who are not familiar with the term cultivar, it just means cultivated variety. So a lot of fruit crops are clonally propagated. You aren't going to be ordering seeds to grow grapes or seeds to grow apples. There are alpine strawberries, little baby strawberries that are grown from seed, but typically they're going to be propagated by woody cuttings, and this helps them be true to type. So if I planted a Honeycrisp apple seed, I would not necessarily be getting a Honeycrisp, but if I can take a cutting from a Honeycrisp apple seed and graft it onto a rootstock, I will have a Honeycrisp apple. Thinking about different gateway fruits, the first thing I always point out on this is that hardest on this list is apples for fresh market. Third easiest on this list is hard cider apples. And that contrast is there mostly because cider apples are able to be grown with some blemishes. And I would also argue that there's kind of two categories of cider apples. So you can manage a fresh eating apple and have lower inputs and use that fresh eating apple in cider production, and hard cider production is what I'm talking about. But there are also traditional cider cultivars that have been grown in Europe for, generations. And some of those tend to be a little bit more susceptible to fire blight. They may work well in Indiana, but they do not survive as willingly in cold climate places such as Minnesota. But then you can see the first one there, the easiest is really a lot of these crops that, and again, honeyberries might not be quite as applicable to Indiana, but certain native crops tend to have a little bit more natural resistance. And so the management is a little bit easier. Also, shrubs just happen to be a little bit easier to pick up the pruning techniques. Got tart cherries and pears. Sweet cherries could kind of fall into the Indiana category, and I'm guessing they'd be a little bit higher on the list for management. But then, yeah, the hard cider apples, raspberries, grapes, June-bearing strawberries, and then day-neutral strawberries, just because day-neutral strawberries do take a little bit more time to get to manage, and they produce fruit all year long, so you better be on top of all that. Blueberries have special soil requirements and all that, and then apples for fresh market. And I just mentioned that if I wanted a Honeycrisp apple, I would take a cutting from a Honeycrisp and I would need to graft that onto a rootstock. So, excuse me here. So apples do require rootstocks. Not all trees have the extensive breeding program for rootstocks like apples do. And rootstocks tend to work by sharing biological molecules with the top part, the sign, and this affects their growth and physiology. And for the most part, there's rootstocks that are adapted to different soil systems and climates, some that are more cold tolerant, but they majorly can affect the tree's final size. And so dwarfness is one of those large things. And with dwarfness, you get a more precocious tree. So it's going to end up producing fruit a lot faster than a standard apple tree. And that's why a lot of apple growers have switched to high density apple production. It gives you your returns a lot faster. However, there's a lot more requirements for irrigation because when you have a smaller tree, you have a smaller root system, as well as the need to trellis. But yeah, of course, there are some rootstocks that also have resistance to disease, so that can be a plus, especially when it comes to thinking about management and decreasing the need for as much of a spray program. So I always just recommend for people who are trying to figure out which cultivars to grow in your area to talk to other growers or talk to nurseries or a lot of other sources, as well as, kind of getting an idea of what consumers are interested in. But a lot of other factors that are going to affect how you choose a cultivar come down to your climate in your site and how compatible that is with a certain cultivar, the ease of management. So yeah, is there natural disease resistant? What's the vigor like? What's the growth habit like? I mentioned consumer preferences, as well as what are you going to do with your fruit, right? So fruit quality becomes a little bit less important if you are going to be making jams or jellies or cider. And by fruit quality, right, that doesn't mean like it's okay to add rotten fruit or like extremely underripe fruit that was never managed, but there's just a little bit more flexibility there. And then thinking about fruit quality and storability, especially if there's a larger operation, how well certain apples store can be really important. And there is variation as well as a lot of different techniques to enhance storing, which this talk won't really be covering. But just keeping in mind if you're working with growers, most growers are not in the market to purchase the perfect land for their future fruit crop, right? We're usually, if you have land, you're working with the land that you have. So the climate, land layout, and then production goals can all steer plant selection versus the other way around. I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are aware of the new USDA hardiness maps that have come out. So it's really, I say new with quotations because it's really us having a better idea of where we're at right now. And the USDA hardiness plant zones are based on extreme annual minimum temperatures. So that's important. Also, a lot of the newer maps have a lot more weather stations added to them. So again, it's a little bit more accurate. And this can indicate, chilling requirements and growing season length that may be available for certain plants, but there's no guarantees. Every year to year variations are also really important. So speaking of chilling requirements, if folks are not familiar with that, similar to like needing a certain amount of growing degree days, a certain amount of heat throughout and growing days throughout the growing season in order to ripen fruit fully, woody plants also need a certain amount of time where they sleep throughout the winter. And these temperatures, so one chilling hour is going to be between 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, it's sort of a rough estimation, right? None of this is a perfect science, but we do start, this starts being counted 1st of October, and I took this off today, so that's why it says 3/11/2024. But the image you can see on your left is just showing the actual chilling hours. So if we're zooming into Indiana, you can see a lot of places are already over 1,200 chilling hours or between 1,000 and 1,200, which is that is a sound amount. I can't remember if something like Honeycrisp needs about 1,200 or to 1,400, right? But that would mean that a lot of plants that have completed their chilling cycle based on the number of hours that they need are going to be exiting their deeper dormancy and getting ready to wake up. And then I really like this other image on your right here, which is the chilling hours departures. So how different is this compared to averages? And by averages, this is you know from 1986 to 2015. So again, it's not like departure from averages of like 500 years or something, right? We don't have that data, but it is still interesting to look at. And you can see some, that dark area has had more than 600 hours of departure away from its average. And then we've got certain other areas that, it's 200 to 400 or 400 to 600. So if things seem to be blooming a little bit early, that's possible because we've just had that accumulation potentially a lot faster. And then, of course, other impacts to climate or impacts to how well and how successful a specific cultivar can grow on a site come down to microclimates. So what's the climate within the growing operation, thinking about topography. Are there low spots where cold can sink into? What is the light availability? What's the orientation of the rows? Are they going north to south or east to west or somewhere in between? How much precipitation is happening throughout the year? What is how many growing degree days are you accumulating through a season? False springs, so getting earlier warm-ups getting warm-ups earlier than anticipated before so again, kind of thinking about that early departure stage, and then also thinking about spring frost and fall frost episodes, which might be a little bit more critical, in the north, where we might have frost until Mother's Day, and you might have your grapes, for example, breaking dormancy, shoots start growing, and then they're really tender, and all of a sudden you get a cold snap, and then you end up having shoots dying, which sometimes you just get a little bit of a burn. Sometimes it really impacts the plant. Grapes happen to have multiple buds within each bud. They have compound buds, so sometimes they have other backup shoots that can take over, but that's not necessarily the case for other fruits where, perhaps you're getting cold temperatures during bloom, and those cold temperatures affect how well pollinators are coming out, or even just high precipitation during bloom. All these factors impact everything, and a lot of them are just out of our control. Some of them are consistent throughout the years, some of them are going to be highly variable. Um, but then kind of jumping in, we'll talk more about site prep here. So just recognizing that because our fruit crops are perennial, so ignoring June-bearing strawberries from this equation, where you may be rotating fields every now and then, is just so important to plan and prepare thoroughly. People are, you're investing in a long-term growing operation, so why not take a little bit extra time to make sure everything's set up right? Flat land tends to not be, especially with really heavy, thick clay soils, affects drainage. And this can be really impactful to the root systems, potentially suffocating roots. And it can affect nutrient uptake, potentially cause for a situation where there's disease incidents, issues with winter kill, and then just overall tree health can be lowered. So having drainage can be really, really critical to successfully growing fruit. And then here's just this image showing you what a frost pocket looks like. So when that cold air can sink into these low spots, can really be damaging. And then there's that image on the left showing the frost dam. So if you had like a hedge or a bunch of vegetation at the bottom of the hill, that cold air can't drain back. So it ends up kind of pooling back at the plants and creating another issue with frost. What is your soil type like? So I mentioned clay, heavy clay soils can be really challenging for some reasons with drainage. Just a quick reminder here that soil particles are classified into sand, which is the largest particle, silt, which is smaller, and then clay, which is the smallest. Um, and I've got this map of Minnesota here. I apologize, I could have switched this to Indiana, but there's going to be variations of soil throughout your state. And typically, kind of having a soil type that has good drainage, but a good amount of organic matter can be helpful. Some people will say, well, wine grapes, they need to be like they really don't need a lot they need to be stressed in order to create good wine, which is true to a point, but if the plant itself is suffering so much, it's not going to be able to keep up with fruit quality. So and then just recognizing, why do we need organic matter? Why is a certain amount of clay important? And that's to allow nutrients to actually be held in the soil so it can exchange with the root system and be there and not just get flooded out. So sand has very little what's called a cation exchange capacity, its ability to exchange nutrients with a plant's root system, whereas something like clay has much higher capacity to do that, as well as organic matter. Soil pH, different fruit crops have ideal pH ranges. I have one, okay, so I apologize that I have this up here that says 6 to 7. That's more applicable just solely to apple production, but different crops have different needs. Like I had mentioned, blueberries have a requirement for very low pH. And this matters again because of nutrient availability. So some nutrients are just not going to be as available within different pH ranges. And some, if you are pretty close to the range you want to be at, but you're not quite there, that can be realistically amended. But for example, if you were trying to get to pH 6 and you're at 7.8, the efforts that it would take to actually either to acidify that soil could be really great, and it could take a long time to do that. And then if you have water that's highly alkaline, then you're going to be kind of, um, not harming, but interrupting your efforts. So the Soil Web Survey is a great resource. There are videos online that you can find that can show you how to really, capture your area of interest and get the information that you want out of that. I know of the testing labs in Minnesota, but I'm sure There are plenty in Indiana. And, so being able to take a soil test is just really important. So we often recommend doing some type of test every 3 to 5 years, but also before planting, which is the most critical time. If somebody only takes one soil test, really the one before they plant is going to be the most important one. And you can see a shovel being used here, but there are soil probes that can be more accurate sorry, just a little bit more encapsulating of the soil within a good range. And then recognizing that within fruit production, um, soil tests can be used in joint with foliar testing as well to kind of see, well, I know it's in my soil, but what's actually getting into the plant. So this is an example of a soil test report. You can see that it has nutrient levels based on the test results. It shows the organic matter, the soil texture is listed, potential recommendations for amending pH is on there. This is specifically geared towards grapes. So if you know someone who's going to be submitting a soil test, they typically should be listing the specialty crop that they're working with. But you'll note that there's not a lot of information on nitrogen with soil tests, and that's pretty typical. There are ways to do nitrogen sampling, but it tends to be a little bit deeper and potentially not quite as accurate. So mentioning nitrogen here. So a lot of times nitrogen applications are recommended to do in like split applications. So if you had to put on 60 pounds of nitrogen, you might put 30 on during an earlier growth stage of green vegetation and put another 30 on, maybe like a few weeks later or a month later, and then slowing down after that major flush of green growth has ended and fruit has set, and maybe we're at the solstice. At least in my area, it would be around then. And then there's really this the folks should not be really applying nitrogen towards the fall when you want vegetative growth to slow down, because it can interrupt the ability for plants to acclimate and harden off and go into dormancy. And this graph on the right just shows how many pounds of nitrogen per acre are typically released with percent organic matter. What about phosphorus? In Minnesota, at least, it's pretty rare to have deficiencies of phosphorus. But if people are putting in phosphorus, typically you want to be doing that pre-planting because you're not going to be incorporating a lot of nutrients once plants are in the ground. So you might have more deficiency in sandier soils. And then what about initial weed pressure? So if you're planting over an annual rotation, you're typically going to have more annual weeds that you deal with. If you're planting over a pasture or a perennial stand, then you're typically going to have more perennial weeds. But the most important thing to really note here is that getting weeds under control before planting is super important. And there are chemical and non-chemical options for this. Especially if someone's organic, they may end up doing full field tillage over and over again to really try to disrupt perennial weed growth. And, that can have impact with the soil over time. But yeah, sometimes it's the only option when it comes to being an organic grower. So you can see here with preparing your site, there are options to do strip tillage. And again, if you were using herbicides to control weeds, that might work out. But then there's also the option to do full field tillage, plant, and then seed those alleyways. And when choosing something in the alleyway, you typically, especially from a sustainability standpoint, you want to choose something like a red fescue that will go dormant during the drought periods. It's not going to be competing for water at that point and become an actual weed that's competing with your plants. So there are options to mix in cover crops with that alleyway planting, but you just want to make sure that you have something that can handle equipment and not compete. thinking about planting density, there are certain charts, like this is from Cummins Nursery, that can really help you determine how many plants you need to order based on your spacing between rows as well as between plants. Will you need to construct a trellis? Some crops really need it, like grapes, high density apples, raspberries and blackberries. Freestanding apples, not so much. They might need a pole for support. But this is just another thing to think about, the cost, construction, and maintenance of trellises. And then what materials are you going to need in order to construct those? Planting, so planting can be simply done by digging holes with shovels. Augering is an option. If you do auger, you want to make sure to plant pretty quickly so that the soil doesn't settle and kind of clump up on itself. There are planting machines for larger operations. I've heard that the DNR, at least in Minnesota, might be willing to lend out certain planters. So I don't know if that's something that you're coming across with a grower where they're trying to figure that out. That could be something to inquire about. But you'll just want to make sure that you have everything all set by the time that you're ready to put plants in the ground. And if you're working with apple trees, for example, where they're a grafted tree, you want to make sure that graft union is above the ground. The higher the graft union is above the ground, the more it's going to be doing its thing. So the more it's going to be dwarfing versus if it's too low, if you plant the graft union below the soil, then you get rooting of the scion, and that really defeats the purpose of the whole tree. But really just making sure that you're digging your hole deep enough to have the root systems so that they're not going to start circling around themselves. With grapes, sometimes you end up trimming the roots because they come in and they're like really, really long, longer than what you really need. So again, now we're going to talk about plant management. Let's think back to this slide here with the different management zones, the planting row, what's adjacent to the planting row, as well as between the rows, also known as the alleyway. There's a whole list of management practices that can take place during a growing season. And I just want to emphasize that each fruit crop kind of has its unique requirements. So success really happens when there's enough time and energy to invest into one crop. Once I don't recommend putting in blueberries, apples, and grapes all at the same time. Get to know one crop, get to know its management, do it well, and then, expand from there. And same with, putting in 1 acre of grapes versus like starting off with 15. You're not going to necessarily have the energy to manage all of that and help train those crops properly. So there's dormant pruning, early canopy management strategies, the spray program, managing suckers and runners for strawberries or rhizomes for raspberries, controlling insect pests, maybe doing summer pruning, so pruning off green tissue. How are you managing the nutrition of the plant, protecting it from wildlife, monitoring fruit quality, and then finally the task of harvest and potentially storage as well. So again, coming back here, we've got that star next to management techniques. This all there's a lot that can get roped into sustainability with how you're choosing to manage a fruit crop. And some of this comes down to how you manage disease incidents, whether you're choosing non-chemical weed management tactics, incorporating integrated pest management, choosing more direct ways of watering your plants like drip irrigation, and then doing nutrition tests versus just like, getting hyped up about spraying micronutrients and putting them on when there's no actual need or you don't know if there's actually a need. So what is canopy management? Canopy management is basically manipulating the canopy of a tree or a vine in order to allow more light to come in, increase airflow, and all this affects temperature as well. It affects leaf wetness, which all of those things, again, are going to impact disease incidence. Canopy management also gives us an opportunity to reduce the amount of fruit that's on a vine or a tree because overcropped plants tend to not be able to fully ripen the fruit. So it's a balance of how many leaves do we have compared to how much fruit. Can those leaves bring in enough photosynthase to actually help with ripening? And having sun exposure can help a lot too. So this is why pruning with apples began to change. There was research that showed that apples that were on the inside of the canopy ripened much later than those on the outside. So it became a question of, well, how do we basically grow a tree so that most of the fruit is get like it's on the outside? So here's some visuals thinking about dormant pruning with grapes. You're taking off basically 90% of the whole vine. Shoot thinning is another stage where you can, this vine was already pruned and it's still really, really thick with vegetation. So more shoots needed to come off. Fruit thinning. So being able to, there's chemical thinning in apples, or hand thinning, as well as hand thinning in grapes to be able to reduce fruit and increase the quality, managing runners and strawberries there so that the energy inputs are going into the fruit and not into making more baby plants. Summer pruning, common in some apple production strategies as well as grapes. And then leaf pulling, that's really extreme. That's not how I would pull leaves. That's a little bit too much, but it gives you this exaggerated visual of basically exposing fruit to the sun. And not only are you ripening the fruit with the sun, but you're also ripening those buds that are setting fruit for the following season. So that's really important. So integrated pest management is another step, especially with insect pests, where fruit growers can be sustainable. They can reduce inputs by using certain integrated pest management models. NUA is out of Cornell, and there are a couple of any weather station can be on the NUA map, and there are a couple that are in Indiana, not a whole lot, but those models can help us start to get an idea of when to scout for insects. And we may have pheromone traps, not for Japanese beetles, but for things oriental fruit moth. And so trapping gives us an idea of what's present. And then we can gain certain thresholds of when to spray. But beyond having thresholds of spraying, mating disruption is kind of maybe shouldn't just be thrown in the middle there, but that's a way of approaching managing insects without actually spraying. So mating disruption works by confusing males typically to be, deterring males away from females by confusing them with fake females out there. And then there are precision spray tools that are really cool. Maybe not going to be an option for like a small specialty crop grower, but it is important to recognize that there's more and more of this technology coming out each year. And Raven is one example of a tool where you can set your rate, your miles per hour that you're planning to drive, and it will, help you so that you're not just spraying endlessly. So you can save some money as well as just not be putting excess amounts into the environment. Hail netting has been researched at the University of Minnesota, so it has implications for protecting apple trees against extreme weather events of hail, but it also was researched for looking at insect exclusion, and that's really interesting, as well as bird exclusion. So again, more research probably needs to be done, but is there this potential to be able to use physical exclusion to avoid insect pest issues versus actually using chemicals? And then thinking about herbicides and weed management, there's a lot of disadvantages to using herbicides. There's a lot of advantages as well when they're used appropriately and at the right time, at the right phase of production. But just, kind of that reminder, as everybody knows, you're putting chemicals out into the environment. Herbicide resistance is a big issue. So even if folks are not using integrated approaches for managing weeds, there's still the concept of diversified weed management, which rotates different herbicides in order to tackle weeds, and this is for the purpose of preventing herbicide resistance. There's always a risk to human health with mixing and loading if you are doing it improperly, or if you're spraying without a closed cap or something, if you're doing a larger operation or if you're not using effective PPE. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of herbicides are only effective at certain growth stages, so timing is super important. And then some herbicides that you want to use may end up damaging the crop you're working on or crops near it. And having bare ground year long can affect soil structure and biology. So it's really important to recognize. However, you do have those alleyways of grass in between, so that kind of gives a little bit more protection with runoff. So what are non-chemical weed management options? Got mulching, mowing, animal grazing, which food safety, a little bit of food safety coming in there, because if you have animals grazing, you have fresh manure, and there are regulations about when fresh manure can be applied. If you are growing cider apples, grapes, or hops, something that will be boiled and fermented. It has a kill step to it, so you have a little bit more leniency with that. Tillage isn't an option. Again, flame and steam weeding's there. It's not very practical, especially if you have plastic irrigation systems, and cover crops sometimes can really help to suppress weeds, and sometimes they can be a weed themselves. So we often don't recommend putting in cover crops for the first few years of planting. But if you're mulching, for example, there's a lot of tactics that go beyond weeding by influencing soil temps, microbe populations, as well as soil moisture, as long as they're making good contact with the soil. Some plastic mulches tend to be reflective and can be impacting fruit quality. And then there's also the ability to use some of these mulches to actually overwinter plants. So I mentioned drip irrigation, especially if folks are using landscape fabric, that's going to be kind of a time when it's used, but drip irrigation would typically be used for grapes as well as high density apple production. There's not a lot of overhead irrigation that's implemented. There are techniques to use overhead irrigation for preventing spring frost, but it takes a lot of water. So again, it's not being used like super commonly. But yeah, other things like day neutral strawberry production are also going to be irrigated. I mentioned tillage, and tillage may be a part of renewing fields for strawberries or during pre-establishment phases. And there are ways to till next to plants, but machinery is expensive. You're disrupting the root system. Repeated tillage has its own negative effects. So it's not something that I would say is just super common. But here are some really interesting images of different tillers that are used in grape production. And they're a little painful for me to look at. Foliar testing, so I started to mention that earlier. It's kind of that tier 2 of test, don't guess, and it can help growers understand what's really getting into their plant. So just a reminder that foliar nutrient deficiencies aren't always indicative that there's a lack of a nutrient in the soil. That's why you have your soil test as well as your foliar test, but comparing those two together can be really helpful. So here's just a quick, we're kind of wrapping up our time here, but recognizing that if you're doing foliar testing, it's not going to be the same for every plant, and there's specific instructions to be able to harvest either the petioles, the leaf stems, or the leaves themselves for testing. So just something to be aware of. And just recognizing that nutrients can be applied in multiple ways. So chemical fertilizers are always available, but then mulch, compost, other organic inputs are available. Foliar applications can be there as a rescue spray. Magnesium would be a great example. And some micronutrients, if needed, like boron, can be sprayed foliarly with more success without going into toxicity, like when you may try to apply it to the ground. Fertigation is an option, especially for using landscape fabrics. And then you have the ability to direct fertilizer more into those planting rows versus fertilizing the alleyway and the planting rows all together. So just keeping that in mind, that there's a lot of options. how do we start to think about, parameters for harvest. And these are a couple of great graphs that are related to grapes, but grapes, tend to, as they ripen, their acidity goes down, so they're not as sour, and then the sugars and aromatics, all of that starts to come up. And you can capture some of that by measuring soluble solids, which is a measurement of sugars, a percent sugar within the fruit, as well as measuring pH and titratable acidity. But for bricks, it's pretty simple. You can just be in the field, and there's these handheld refractometers that can give you a good idea of where you're at with that. So that's helpful. So some concluding statements here. I would say that perennial fruit crops are a long-term investment that can deliver a unique product to diversified farms. The best gateway fruits to start growing depend on a grower's goals, and also what they're comfortable doing and what equipment they might have as well. So thinking about native fruit crops, strawberries that are, working with day neutral strawberries, which can be managed more like an annual crop. If you don't have permanent land, that might be a great option. And a lot of people who have specialty crop operations may not have permanent land. So that's always a really great place to start. But just remembering that sustainable growing considers concepts like plant and site longevity, as well as environmental conservation and climate resilience, farmer health and community vitality. So the big picture of all of that really leads to a sustainable operation. But within management itself, sustainability can be considered in many steps, including integrative pest management, nutrient management, the site selection, the actual cultivar you select. Maybe you select a cultivar that has more inherent resistance in it, and that can be a cultural strategy. So here are some resources for you. If you are interested in learning more about nutrition management, we have this really great guide with the University of Minnesota. That's a QR code to it if you want to take out your phone and look at that. Penn State does have some resources, as well as Purdue. The Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide is a really great resource. It gets updated pretty frequently. As you can see, it's on the 2023-2024 version right now. And then there's the University of Minnesota's Yard and Garden Fruit website. Again, not everything is going to be completely transferable because we are in a more northern state, but there's at least going to be some things, concepts that you can recognize, and then that'll help steer you towards figuring out what to find. As well as we have a fruit and vegetable farming page that's geared a little bit more towards farmers, but I would say both of those are excellent resources. Again, if you want to take out your phone here and look at this, we have our own newsletter here. We have tips as well as events that happen. Some of those events are remote, so those would be things that you could join up. Pumpkin grower meetups in the fall, and all of that. So if you want to be a part of that newsletter, feel free to go there and check it out. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure to be here with you all. And this is just a picture of the up north with some good snow for a pruning workshop that we had in February. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Oops. There we go.
Well, thanks, Maddie. That was
Absolutely.
wonderful. There were a couple of questions that came through on the chat. At the beginning, there's a question about, do you have recommendations for ground cover or establishing cover crops under wine grapes? And then more specifically, do you recommend red and or white clovers in a ground cover mix?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't specialize a lot in cover crops, but I know like I actually managed a vineyard for a couple of years in Cambridge, Wisconsin, and we did grow white clover and it worked out pretty well. But yeah, you would just want to make sure, I guess, I don't have a direct answer, but you would want to consider the total height of the clover, as well as how well it overwinters. if it is going to flower and attract a lot of pollinators, something that's important to keep in mind is to mow that cover crop if you're spraying insecticides that are going to be harmful to pollinators later on. Terry, do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't specifically, other than what you've already discussed, because it is, right, it is so challenging, and then trying to reduce any pests that may be coming in as well. Um, and I wasn't sure if there's any specific research that's happening with that as well, because it's a hard topic to find information on, like what to be putting in your alleyways that are helpful.
Yeah, and if anybody has a question, I don't know if Terry, like if I should just put my email in the chat, but if you want to email me, I can definitely look into things a little bit more.
Yeah, totally. If you can put your contact info in there, that'd be great.
Sure.
And there is one more question, talking about guilds. So how important are guilds under fruit trees?
Guilds?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
So
Yeah.
guilds are the permaculture concept of having like the ground cover and then the medium growing like raspberries. So it's that whole
Oh, okay,
concept
okay.
of a guild.
Yeah. So how important is it to have guilds underneath fruit crops? I mean, I guess so that's all going to come down with and thanks for clarifying that, with how much those understory crops end up competing with the upper story crops, as well as, if those understory crops can tolerate shade. So when you have canopies, and this is kind of what I was alluding to with saying there are challenges with agroecology, because with fruit, you really want to be maximizing sunlight. Now, there are some crops, I think like um, hazelnuts, like service berries, potentially a few other crops that can tolerate more shade. So if you wanted to do something like that and you knew you had a pretty vigorous site and that those crops weren't going to be competing with your main, not your main crop, but your upper story crop, that would be probably the most important consideration. Oftentimes, if you look at like an agroecology diagram, it's always got like a grapevine growing up a tree. And it's like, well, what's the purpose of that grapevine? Because once it gets into the canopy, all of a sudden it's just shaded. And even underneath, on just the trunk, it's still shaded. So these are kind of you know, I think that's the goal, is to figure out what plant to plant interactions would be really beneficial. And I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done on that. But those are some things to think about when it comes to like understory planting or working with guilds.
Great. Thank you. That's all the questions that we had that came through the chat.
Okay.
Um,
I
and
think I lost oh, there it is. Okay. I'm gonna put my email in there. It's in the more.
yeah, and we'll send a follow-up email as well, and we'll make sure to include your contact information in that too, to people that attended and didn't attend.
Okay, great.
Um, so thank you, Madeline, for coming and joining us today, all the way from Minnesota. Thank you for getting up a little earlier.
Yeah, who knew it was going to be daylight savings time?
I know,
I,
I
I
know.
need to like have a big red day on the daylight savings time block. So, yeah, I know it's early for you all as well. So, thank you so much for bringing this opportunity to me to join this talk today, and have a good rest of your meeting.
Thank you, Madeline.
All
Have a good
right.
rest of your day.
Bye.
Well, gosh, that was great. So Madeline's information's in there if you have any other questions. And we will get on with um the rest of our day with regional updates. Oop, too fast. So we're gonna start off with the Northwest. Marianne.
Hi, I'm here.
Great.
Thank you. So here are a couple of things that I've been working on in the past month. So conference season is over for us. Our team was able to attend the Marble Seed Conference in Wisconsin, La Crosse, Wisconsin. And then we also attended the Small Farms Conference, and we had a booth there. We were able to make connections with farmers and other uh, educators in Indiana. I've also been meeting with different county SWCDs. Some of you are out there and out here in the meeting, and wanted to highlight specifically Warren and Fountain counties that are getting together and starting to form a working group. I'm excited to see what they have what programs they have coming. Um, and also being involved in the Black Loam Conference, and I have a slide later about the upcoming one in Merrillville, Indiana. I've also been working on publishing the results of the research trial that we conducted last summer at the PD Purdue Ag Center. So one of them was on the bolting of brassicas, and one of them was on a compost trial, and we did prepare a presentation. So if you want to check out like some of the results that we got, you can see them right there. I'm posting the links in the chat. And then I've also been going on garden visits and giving technical assistance on cover crops to different people that have reached out. Specifically, wanted to highlight the picture on the bottom right, was able to go with Sam Lovold from Montgomery County SWCD to the local high school that he graduated from, and did a site visit and did soil health assessments and collected a soil sample for soil testing. Yeah, so that was really good. Next slide, please. And then, like I mentioned, Black Loam Conference in 2024 is coming up. The first one is in Merrillville, Indiana on March 28th. If you are interested in attending, you do have to register, and I will post the link in the chat right now. So they'll have representatives from local organizations, and we'll also have people from different agencies that will come up and talk about what the programs they have to offer, and it will be all about connecting um, BIPOC producers with resources and our agencies. Next slide, please. And then I also wanted to highlight that in the last urban update, we had Kevin Allison share about the nutrient management calculator. So I wanted to highlight that that nutrient management calculator is out and that you should check it out. The calculator helps you do fertilizer or get fertilizer recommendations, application rates for different fertilizers, has a compost calculator, and specifically to crops in Indiana. It also um, can also make recommendations based on soil test results. So it's like a really good resource if you're getting into nutrient management. And it's a really good educational tool and also helps you do garden math, which I think is very useful. Um, and he'll be showing us later in the urban update how to find it in the website. So check it out. And I'm glad to be a part of this project. Next slide. I think that's it for me. So I'll move it to Terry.
Great. Thanks, Marianne.
Yeah.
So I echoing what Marianne said about it being conference season. So I also attended Marble Seed and the Purdue Small Farm Conference, or this Purdue Small Farm Conference, and it was a lot of fun just connecting with a lot of different growers and agricultural professionals across the region. For me, I also had a really awesome opportunity to go be a guest lecturer at the University of St. Francis here in Fort Wayne. We had about 20 college students that are in a soil science class. And I got to talk about soil science a little bit and then diving into the soil health practices and conservation and why it's important to have these conservation practices for specifically for small-scale diversified agriculture. This past weekend on Saturday, I traveled out to South Bend in the wee hours of the morning, and I participated in the growing summit that was being hosted by Unity Gardens. We had our conservation corner, which you can see in the picture, where we were I got to sit alongside the soil and water people and the invasives and native people. And I also got to give a talk on soil health. It was a well-attended presentation. I had about 20 folks in there. It was a lot of fun too. It was an interesting crowd, admittedly. As I was tabling, there was a lot of gardeners that were coming through that are active gardeners. And as soon as I would talk about soil, they were just like, I'm not concerned about that. My soil is just fine. And it was one of the first times that I was at an event where there's like a lot of almost pushback about talking about soil health. So I was nervous on how the talk was going to go, but it was nice to have lots of people excited to learn about soil health. And then also I've just been going to annual meetings and doing different farm visits, which admittedly I am terrible right now at getting pictures. So I will make that a point in the next couple of weeks to get better at the picture taking. And then we've got a couple of upcoming events coming in the Northeast. Tonight we are going to have the Soil Health on the Small Farm, Dan Perkins, excited to join the Kosciuszko crew. Next week is SoilCon, also with the Kosciuszko crew, a full day of learning about soil. And then we've got the Allen County Garden Symposium, which I will be speaking at on soil health alongside lots of other great presentations that are happening throughout the day. And I'd love to have some assistance advertising these upcoming events to our farmers and growers that we have out there. So those are my updates for the Northeast. Next, we have Southwest.
There we go. Hi, everyone. So some highlights from the Southwest. I attended the Knox County annual meeting here in the last week, as well as the others, Small Farms Conference and Marble Seed Conference. It was really exciting because I made a lot of connections, a lot of one-on-one connections with people stopping by the table at small farms. So it really gave me that positive feeling, an excited feeling for the spring. So having those conversations really energized urban soil health, I think. Park Vermilion and Vigo held their garden workshop. I think they had about 25 people in attendance. So it was a great success for their first workshop as a working group. So really excited for them and future things to come. Things that I'm working on and upcoming events. I'm still meeting with the working groups, making my rounds and getting them prepared for the season. March 20th, there's a wild fungi workshop in Vermilion County. I've got the flyer, I think, on the next slides, so you can see all that detailed information, but I believe you can still register for that. And then April 2nd, the Fish Group is putting on a spring garden workshop, which will be held in Morgan County, partnering with their master gardeners and doing a project there at the fairgrounds. Then April 13th, there'll be another spring garden workshop. This will be at Owen County with Bree Ollier. And I don't know if she's still on the call, but I thought I saw her earlier. But she's bringing people out to her farm and showing that whole regenerative process that she has going on at her place. So excited for that. And then April 20th, I will be in Monroe County at Blooming Foods Co-op Market, and I'll be helping with the soil health trailer. So I'm excited for that community interaction there at that event. So next slide. And here's just some pictures of things that have been going on. Things from the Small Farms Conference. That picture there on the far left was a hand washing station. So it was neat to go to that session and kind of learn some little tips and tricks and things along the way. Then we've got Hannah speaking at that garden event in Park Vermilion and Vigo County, which was great. They talked about beneficial bugs and organic agriculture, regenerative farming as well. So that was really great. And then the others, there's the Small Farms Conference, we had a lot of traffic at our table, so that was awesome. And then that's that garden event down there. And I also included the day that I was at Knox County for their annual meeting. It was a gorgeous sunny day, so I took that picture and thought I would just share that with everyone. Next slide. And then here's those flyers for some of the upcoming workshops, that wild fungi workshop. You can check their Facebook page for more information. I believe that will be held in Clinton, Indiana, in Vermilion County. And then that spring gardening workshop in Morgan County as well. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Casey. And next we have the Southeast.
Hey, everybody. For the Southeast, much like everyone, I've been doing a lot of conferences, annuals, and ag breakfasts. And I just want to extend just a thanks to all of the 25 counties that I serve by inviting me to all of these events in your districts. I just really feel a part of the community. And that community of small producers and schools and churches and community organizations and municipalities are really doing great work out there. So thank you very much. This last month, like everyone else, I was at Marble Seed and at Small Farms. We made a lot of connections, learned a lot. It was really fun. Then a couple weeks ago, I got to present at Medora Community School for their Envirothon. We planted some cool season crops. That's that picture right there for one of the classes. You can see all those cover crops that they have planted. I was really proud of them to walk into that situation and see that they were already on it with their early spring cover cropping. And then early next month, I begin working on a SARE grant in the Southeast, focusing on utilizing local composts. And improving them through microbially complete compost inoculation. I'll be working with 3 small farmers and 1 compost producer. So we're going to try to see if we can reduce inputs, reduce early costs, and reduce those, essentially reduce the issue of having to ship big loads of compost across the United States. So upcoming events, the Clark County Soil Working Group is going to be presenting Yard Sprouts workshop on yardening at Indris Park in Clarksville from 6 to 8. On March 25th, I'm going to be presenting compost, vermicompost, and microbes, oh my, in Columbus. It's going to be a really great event where we're going to be looking at compost and soils under a microscope and talking about how living soils impact your plant production. And then on March 26th, our very last Keep It Growing season extension workshop will be at Berry Goods Farm in Morristown. As an on-farm presentation, this is going to be a really great way to wrap up this 7-part series. And I'm really happy to work with Amy Serberg at Berry Goods. She's an amazing producer, and we're going to be going through her high tunnel and really talking about high tunnel production through the season. So next slide, please. And here's just some pictures on the far left. I snapped that on my farm the other day, the first garter snake of the season. He was looking a little pale, but he was out and sunning himself and decided that it was too much trouble to move away from me. So I got to stalk him a little bit. Right below that, the students are planting some radishes and some carrots in their raised beds at Medora Community School. And then we've got 2 of those posters for our workshops coming in the next couple of weeks. So please head to the Clark County Soil and Water Conservation District to sign up for the Yard Sprouts workshop, or Eventbrite for composting, vermicomposting, and microbes. Oh my, both are free, and we'd love to see lots of your smiling faces. That's all I've got from the Southeast. And again, thanks so much for continuing your good work out there, everybody.
Thanks, Megan. Ellie, you're up.
Yeah, just a couple of quick reminders that on grant opportunities, the ISDA RIFC grant was pushed back to get a little bit more time to March 15th. Granted, that's very soon and probably too late to really do a big push for promotion, but to remind us all that this is a excellent opportunity for those in the middle of the food chain, and thinking about the fruit presentation could really help support some of those producers on storage and transportation for fruit crops. And also, not to put Megan Ayers on the spot, but she has been personally going through this grant application for her farm and could be a resource in the future for answering questions for those details that aren't readily available on going through this large grant application. And then March 15th, also, the CSP deadline is coming up. I'm sure most of you are working on that from NRCS's standpoint, and a reminder that with the increase in that minimum payment, this could be a really great opportunity for those growers that are already doing conservation practices on their land to help them on supporting new activities on their farms. And then April 1st, and the NACD Urban and Community Conservation Grants, those are available solely for SWCDs and tribes. And yet I also put this out for any producers that are on the call, that if you are engaged in your community and want to see more urban soil health or conservation work happen, to talk with your local SWCD and see if we can get a creative project off the ground. And then the Urban Ag and Innovative Production Grants, the call out went out in February for those. That's coming up. I did just hear last night that they're not doing a huge push on this through NRCS right now due to some federal funding issues. So I'll move on from that one and just share the reminders from annual conference for the ISWCD. Their call out for abstracts is due March 31st. And then at the end of this week, they're looking to add 8 SWCD staff and supervisors that can help on the planning committee. That's most of the work happens on April 5th. So please reach out to Liz Rice if you have interest in that. Next. And coming from our team in about 3 weeks are cover crop seed packages that will be distributed at events that our team is participating in, and also distributed to local working groups. We have a little bit more diversity added to these mixes this year. And thank you to our team who have helped to get them out the door earlier this year. Next. And then reminder that we have our newsletter called The Dirt that comes out monthly, and that's another place to look to for all of our events, grant information, and updates from around the state. And I'll pop all of these links in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. And then we've got, do we have Kevin? Kevin, would you like to talk about this?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen. I basically just wanted to show you where you can find the nutrient management tool. Do you mind allowing me to share my screen, please? Cool. All right. Yeah. So this is the Marion SWCD website. So just go to marionswcd.org. You can come up here to the soil health tab and then down to soil health guide. And you'll scroll down, and basically it's just a list of resources. There's vegetable resources, resources on cover crops. And I guess while I'm trying to find the nutrient management tool, I'll draw your attention to this new training video. So this actually just came up online today. It's the Indiana cover crop tool training video. So if folks are looking to use the cover crop tool Excel workbook and need some assistance with that, that's just a good 20-minute refresher on how to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to nutrient management. So here you'll find the Indiana nutrient management tool. So you can go ahead and click on that, and it will take you to the tool's landing page, which is at marionswcd.org/Indiana nutrient management tool. And from there, you can download the Excel file. So it is possible to open it with Google Sheets. I have not tested it thoroughly in Google Sheets. And it also kind of loses its the formulas are not protected when you do open it in Google Sheets. So it is a little bit tricky to navigate because you might just like accidentally delete a formula, etc. So I would recommend currently using it in Excel until we can get that completely figured out. I also wanted to see if I can get this out of my screen there. I also wanted to show you how to get to a couple more resources here. Gonna go back to Soil Health Guide. And if you scroll down, there's been a lot of talk about insect management. So there is a place on this webpage that has information about native plantings for beneficial insects and pollinators. You can actually click on this insect management page, and that will take you to a more in-depth list of resources about insect management. Ellie wanted me to draw your attention to a couple of these resources, in particular wildflowers for beneficial insects and beneficial insects for fruits and vegetable growers. So these are just PDFs. This is the beneficial insects for fruit and vegetable growers. It talks about beneficial insects and what kind of prey they go after or affect. So you can see that green lacewings have an impact on aphids, beetle larvae, caterpillars, etc. At the page 2 on this, it actually shows pictures, so you can maybe better identify those beneficial insects out in the field or in the garden. And then the other document on that insect management page is wildflowers for beneficial insects. So basically, you can use that other PDF to find, what insects you would like to draw. And then these are the plants that would potentially give good host sites for those insects. So let's say that, yeah, we're looking to increase lacewings, then we could plant some of these plants to increase the habitat. And then there's also pictures of the habitat below. So I think that's just what I wanted to show you. And I will also mention that will be more nutrient management tool trainings. I'm going to try to schedule those very soon to get that out to growers as well. So be on the lookout for that and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. So next, Kara would like to also give us a little update. So Kara, she's all yours.
Great, thanks, Terry. My name's Kara Bergschneider. I am the Indiana's Urban and Small Scale Conservationist within RCS. And as Madeline was talking, it occurred to me that it'd be a great time to go over a couple of our NRCS practices that we offer that have been scaled down for small scale growers that can directly add woody perennials into cropping systems. So the first is alley cropping. This practice puts in perennial trees and shrubs that are nut or fruit producing into blocks of annual production. So an example of this is if you have a diversified vegetable farm, then adding in some rows of perennial fruit or nut trees. So examples of that would be apple, pear, sour cherry, some of the perennials that Madeline talked about. We also have the hedgerow planting, which is 422. This has not been scaled down for small scale, but it still is very applicable and a great conservation practice. This adds in natives to the landscape. So things like elderberry, hazelnut, aronia, serviceberry, some of those natives that Madeline was also talking about. And then in conjunction with diversifying the operation through adding in perennial woodies, we also have associated practices that have been scaled down for small scale growers. So cover crops, that was mentioned. Mulching, always a great practice to conserve our water, reduce erosion, increase organic matter, increase biology in the soil. And then we have irrigation practices. Madeline touched on the importance of irrigating during establishment. So this is for micro irrigation such as drip or wobbler sprinklers. And that is to improve water and energy efficiency. So there already need to be a system in place, but it's being replaced by something more efficient, like a drip tape or wobblers. And then I just really quickly wanted to mention that these slides that I put up, they are part of a presentation that I gave at the Indiana Small Farm Conference. And that went over kind of what I view as the top 10 conservation practices that have been scaled down for small scale growers. And that presentation is on the Urban Soil Health website in their box account under presentations, and I'll drop that in the chat. This coming up really soon, we're going to go over the some of our new resources that have been added to ePhotog, and so looking forward to that. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for letting me share, you all, and great work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So next up is partner shares. Is there anyone in around that would like to unmute, tell us about any upcoming things, or anyone that wants to pop any upcoming events coming into their chat? Kara, would you mind unsharing, please?
Sorry, I'm trying to do that.
So Alyssa in the chat reminded us that there's Going Green for Ag that is this Thursday in Allen County. Full day event. Any other? Not a must. All right. Well, we are past our time as well. So we've got just a reminder, our next meeting is April 9th. Our topic is to be determined, but we look forward to seeing you folks there. As always, check us out on